Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I am joined by a new guest today. I'm talking all about the 2002 Carrie TV movie with Richard Newby. Richard, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good, Deanna. Thanks for having me.
Of course, I know there are many Stephen King adaptations that are not so great, so sometimes it's kind of hard to find people willing to talk about them. But before we started here, you said you had actually watched this version of Carrie before. And for anyone who doesn't know, there are 4 Carrie movies in total. So there's still one more to come on this podcast.
Yeah, I'd seen this before. So usually whenever I read a Stephen King book, I try to watch all of the adaptations. So I read Carrie probably, I don't know, like 10 or 11 years ago. And so after reading that, I watched all the adaptations.
Yeah, I feel like it's one of those things where some people just want to watch the movies, but they'll probably only watch the bigger releases. And through doing this podcast, I've certainly learned that there are a lot of things that people who watch sort of more mainstream movies would have absolutely no idea about. And with TV movies too, sometimes those just happen and it's kind of like you never really hear anything about them. So they go under the radar. But before we really dive into the movie here, Richard, do you just want to let our listeners know a little bit more about you?
Yeah, I'm a writer for The Hollywood Reporter. I work in the Heat Vision section, so I cover a lot of genre stuff, horror, science fiction, superhero movies, and I also am covering Lovecraft Country on HBO for THR as well. So that's been really fun. But yeah, all the genre stuff is basically my area, and I'm a huge Stephen King fan. Have been for a long time, so I was really excited to come on this podcast and talk a bit about him.
That's awesome. Lovecraft Country is definitely on my list to get to. I'm in the midst of watching all of the Dead Zone TV series, so I was like, okay, all other TV is going to have to wait until I be completely maniacal and watch all 80 episodes of the Dead Zone. But by the time everyone is listening to this episode, I will have started Lovecraft Country, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this first season of that plays out. But one of the things I always talk about with these movie episodes is the cast. And this is where this movie got my attention because you have Angela Bettis as Carrie, and she was 28 when she played Carrie. So she was the oldest person to have played a high school Carrie White. You have Patricia Clarkson as Margaret White, Rena Sofer as Miss, oh my goodness, I always butcher this last name, but Miss Desjardins. I'm not 100% confident in that pronunciation, even though I've now watched 3 movies of Carrie. And Candace McClure as Sue Snell. Really, you kind of just pay attention to a handful of characters in this. There are some other characters who come into play. For instance, Miles Meadows, who plays Kenny, he's kind of like one of the boys who goes when they go slaughter the pig to get the pig blood to drop on Carrie. And he was actually in The Mangler too, which I might be the only person who knows that because I don't know too many other people who have watched The Mangler 2 aside from my friends who watched it for the podcast, for me only, pretty much. And you also have David Keith, who is a fairly big name in the television world. And other than that, I really didn't know too many of these names. You have Jesse Cadotte. I'm not 100% sure I'm pronouncing that correctly either, but he was in an episode of The Dead Zone. So I was kind of just looking for these ties because there are often people who will recur in Stephen King adaptations, and it always fascinates me which people end up in multiple Stephen King things.
Yeah, that is cool. I also noticed that David Keith was on Firestarter as well.
Yes, very true.
That is a cool tie.
Yeah, so what did you think when you initially saw this cast? Personally, I was excited for Patricia Clarkson as Margaret White because I felt like that was perfect casting, but kind of fell flat, honestly.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was most excited for Patricia Clarkson. And even though I'd seen this before, I didn't particularly remember much of her depiction of Margaret White. And so, like after seeing her in Sharp Objects,
Yes.
I was like really expecting I was like, oh, why can't I remember her in this? So I was really expecting her to like kind of carry it away in the same way that like Piper Laurie did, or even like Julianne Moore in the more recent one. And yeah, she's not very noticeable in this. And then Angela Bettis, I'm a big fan of this movie that she's in called May, um, and it's also a horror movie. She actually did it the same year that the
Okay.
Carrie adaptation came out, and so she's like a socially awkward veterinary assistant in that movie, and she becomes obsessed with this guy, and it takes a dark turn. But I think that her performance in that is really great. So I was looking forward to seeing her as Carrie again, and I think that definitely she is probably the standout for me in terms of the cast.
Yeah, like you mentioned, after watching Patricia Clarkson in Sharp Objects, and not to mention she was in The Green Mile, she was the sick wife who John Coffey had to cure. And so you have a lot of recurring people in this, actually. So I was expecting a much more sort of animated performance from her, but she was very reserved. She was still the angry, evil mom who wouldn't let Carrie do anything, but it didn't hit the same way. And it just felt so disappointing that you would get someone like Patricia Clarkson and not let her just run with the performance. And given that this was, a screenplay by Brian Fuller, I kind of felt like you would have some more of the showiness that we sort of see with his work in Hannibal, which is a show that I adore. And it just didn't really come together. And then obviously we'll talk about this shortly, but there are some story changes that they make that I was like, oh, okay, that's what you're going for.
Yeah, I'm also a big Brian Fuller fan. I love Hannibal, and I had forgotten that he had written this because it's very different from the things of his that I've seen. Uh, it was very surprising to see the way that some of the characters were presented and some of the dialogue, which uh, it's very much a 2002 TV movie.
Yes. I could sense that sort of Brian Fuller feel, though, when you get these images of Carrie just walking down the street, with all of the pig's blood on her. And there are certain things that stood out. And I was like, okay, maybe this is going to be okay. And okay might be a stretch, but as far as the story goes, how did you feel about the changes that they ultimately made?
Well, so first, I think the flashback narrative, kind of doing it, starting with the her classmates being interviewed in the police station, and then kind of like flashing back to what happened leading up to the prom and the prom itself. I thought that structure was interesting because in the book there's a court case, and then you kind of go back through these various like documents and accounts to kind of get a sense of what happened with Carrie White. So I thought that was interesting. It was an interesting choice, although I don't think it was handled particularly great. But the other story changes I actually like wasn't a big fan of. I'm a fan of like when things are updated, and the novel was written in the 70s, so I understood that there had to be like some changes. I don't know, none of the changes really felt like they did anything for me, or they really like brought anything new to the characters, or really deepened any understanding of Carrie and her relationships and interactions.
Right. I think what bothered me the most about those police interview scenes was that it gave away that not everyone was going to die. And obviously, from the original and from the book, we know that Sue Snell had Tommy ask Carrie to the dance, so Sue wasn't physically going to be inside the gym at the dance. And if I'm not mistaken, though, she kind of catches on in the original movie to what's happening and does go to the school. But as soon as I started seeing these other interviews and I was like, okay, well, that's like the student body president or whoever she was. And we had seen her in classes with Carrie and some of the other girls. So I was like, okay, does she not go to the dance? I was kind of confused as to who these people were and why they were the ones being interviewed, because of the fact that in my head, I was like, oh, well, everyone in the gym dies. And that's very much not the case in this one. I think by the end of it, they say about 10 people got out through an air vent, and one of them is the gym teacher. So I just felt like that was too drastic of a change. And I understand that because of this coming out shortly after the Columbine incident happened, you get a sense that maybe 2002 wasn't the right time to do this.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think that they're definitely, it feels like they're holding back. Even with what happens, to her classmates in the gym scene, there's a sense that, it's really holding back from like the horror element, which is actually like kind of surprising because you think of Carrie as being this horror story, and I feel like that horror element really did not come through. And like part of what you were saying in terms of these police station interviews and seeing who survives, that definitely like cuts away some of the horror and like the anticipation, of what happens, at the prom.
Yeah, plus you have the fact that, obviously spoilers for anyone, who doesn't want the final moments spoiled for them. But if you haven't watched the 2002 Carrie by now, chances are maybe you don't plan to do that, and that's okay too. But to have the ending where Carrie survives was just so jarring for me, because I was like, okay, things with Patricia Clarkson portraying Margaret didn't work out quite as well as I had hoped. And so I was kind of running it through my head, okay, how are they going to end this? Because it wasn't something that felt nearly as tragic as the book or the Brian De Palma movie both do. And for a Stephen King movie to have a half happy ending didn't feel right for Carrie, at least.
Yeah, I really don't like this new ending where she survives. I think it strips away the heartbreak, and I think that Carrie is probably one of my favorite Stephen King characters, and it's because she's such a tragic figure, and I feel like, as Stephen King has talked about, comparing Carrie to girls that he went to school with, and the kind of tragic circumstances that surrounded their lives from being bullied. And so I feel like for Carrie to live, it really kind of takes away the message of what his book was about. It takes away the tragedy of Carrie's story. And I also, it's just like, it's weird to me. It feels like a non-ending. And I had read that there were talks, NBC had talks to use this TV movie as a pilot to launch a Carrie TV show, and she would travel around the country helping other kids with powers. And it's just, I feel like the producers just misunderstood, kind of what the power of Stephen King's novel was and the power of Carrie's story.
Yeah, and you have the moments where she's walking through the town, and you can kind of tell they almost just wanted to have a reason to use more CGI. And I think the nice thing about these older movies with a lot of the originals, like Carrie or Firestarter, they used a lot of practical effects. So when things blow up, they are literally blowing up, so they don't age as poorly necessarily. And, Brian De Palma has a very specific style when he's making films. So you also have that going for the original Carrie. You have this iconic director involved. And yes, Brian Fuller is great when it comes to, the horror genre as well, but he wrote the screenplay, he did not direct it. So I think even though he did a good job of maybe writing some of the core elements, I think these changes were just too much, and there were too many of them, because one of the things I really questioned was, where are these police interviews taking place? Because in the book, the town's completely and utterly destroyed, and it ends up being sort of this ghost town, and they make up some story that, there was some kind of like freak accident that wiped out this whole town, and the government just keeps it hush hush. But in this, you're like, wait, are there people still living here?
Yeah, it's very weird. Like, and it also feels like, as if a mass tragedy didn't just happen. Sue is very chill in her police interviews, despite the fact that her boyfriend died in the gymnasium. And then the student council president, she's like eating like a couple of donuts and like very casual about this whole thing. And so there's no sense that like something incredibly traumatic and life altering just happened to all of these people.
The cop even points that out when he's talking to Sue, because she's like, well, it's been 2 weeks. We had all the funerals, and that's that. And you kind of feel like it's because she knows that she at least did the right thing by helping Carrie survive. But at the same time, you would think there would be a little more guilt on her end, which that does not come across at all by the time of the police interview.
No, yeah, she feels very like free of any responsibility in this whole incident. And it's a very strange choice in the way that her character is written, especially like when you compare her to Sue and Brian De Palma's film, who I think very much feels guilty. And we're left in the end with this lingering of her guilt and the horror that she's faced, through this whole situation. And this movie, it's treated very, very casually, and you feel like she's just gonna move on, and this is just a regular high school memory for her.
Which is wild. Absolutely wild. You're kind of like, oh, okay, this is the angle you're going to play here. And I try to be more critical instead of just being completely negative. I try to discuss what I think would have worked better for movies like this, because you said every time you read a Stephen King book, you want to go and watch the adaptations, whether it's 1 or 3. Hopefully you have not watched all 1,800 Children of the Corn movies, but it's one of those things where as you dive into these adaptations, you can tell that there are certain stories where you're kind of like, why is this the one that got adapted numerous times? Maybe it's Children of the Corn, maybe it's The Mangler, maybe it's Sometimes They Come Back. But when you see something like Carrie, you understand why this is a story that has now been done 4 times, kind of. I mean, The Rage, Carrie 2 truly tried to be a sequel to the original, not just a remake. And it did so by bringing back Amy Irving. But this is, like you said, a TV movie reboot. They kind of wanted to make it a pilot, and it's over 2 hours long. And it's because they put these police interviews in. And I think there are too many of them. I feel like we spent too much time with the cop just talking to the students and the gym teacher, and they were basically spelling things out for you. And I don't like it when movies do that.
Yeah, the use of the cops, to extend their running time, which I assume was just to get the television movie block. I assume it ran probably 3 hours on television with commercials.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like the best use of the time, and especially like going back to what you said about Patricia Clarkson's Margaret. It feels like she's barely in it. She doesn't really have much of a presence at all. And I would have preferred that they use, the time instead of the interviews to actually explore more of Carrie's home life and relationship with her mother. Because I think that, ideally 2 hours and 10 minutes could effectively work for a Carrie movie, especially
Yeah.
if they went back to the novel and pulled some of the scenes from there. But really, there seems like there's no reason for the extended runtime in this other than just to meet the kind of television block. But it doesn't contribute to the stories or the characters in any meaningful way. And then scenes that feel like they could be longer seem really short. the whole prom preparations feel really truncated. Carrie's discovery of her powers and kind of learning what she can do with them is also just like really brief.
I definitely would have much preferred more backstory for Carrie and her mother because her mom is strict in this, and sure, she's mean, but she didn't seem over the top evil like you said Piper Laurie did with her performance. And you also have the high school characters. You have Chris Hargensen, Billy Nolan, and some of these performances are just a little hard to replicate. I think we got more of Billy Nolan maybe than the original.
Yeah, which I actually like don't think was a great thing for this movie. I feel like I think John Travolta had such a great presence as Billy Nolan.
Yeah.
You really remembered him. But I mean, this guy, and I don't know if it was just like the direction or what, but he just had zero presence.
He was the guy who was meant to look like the bad boy, and that's all he did was look like the bad boy. There was like such a flatness to the performance, and it really took time away from some of the other things too, like the police interviews did, that would have been better served for the story to dive into those other things more. And because of how many teens we kind of meet and they come and go, there's the couple who sits down with Tommy and Carrie at the table, and I was kind of like, okay, the girl looks familiar, but I'm a little confused because, it's like so many of the mean girls are blonde, and then you have, these other characters just kind of popping in and being part of the conversation. And I was like, I don't even know who these people are and why they're choosing to sit with Tommy and Carrie. It was like, okay, are they friends of Tommy's? Obviously the guy was. And then, you get this feeling that they're not necessarily just trying to be nice to Carrie out of pity. It seems like they really are trying to sort of be welcoming and have her have a good time. And I think at the end, when the ones escaped through the air vent, it almost felt like it was the people who were being nice or nicer to Carrie, other than Tommy, obviously, who make it out.
Yeah, that was a weird thing as well, because I think and this goes back to like the horror element. Like I think that part of what makes Carrie work as a horror novel and what made De Palma's film work as a horror movie is that when she unleashes in the gymnasium at the prom, she's not saving or not using her wrath directing it towards people who are nice to her. I mean, everybody is caught in it. The gym teacher, she dies in De Palma's film, and it's awful, and you feel terrible about it, and that's part of where the horror comes from. But yeah, with this, it was kind of like, okay, well, these few people who were a little more kind to her get to escape and live.
Yeah, I think it was just one of those things that the story was mismanaged just enough to really pull you out of the horror elements of the story. And it felt like maybe because it was made for TV, they went a little lighter on these things. Because if I'm remembering correctly, the original Carrie, well, they didn't really have the rating system that they do now for movies, but obviously naked girls running around, not a PG movie by any means. And the 2013 movie is rated R from what I can tell. So you really get a feeling that this one just had limitations and it wasn't able to go all in on the story that Stephen King wrote, which is unfortunate. And I really, really did want to like this more than I did. Angela Bettis as Carrie White is obviously the runaway highlight for this. And I was still excited about Patricia Clarkson, but by the end I was like, oh, okay. They kind of did her wrong in this one, even though you don't want to like Margaret White, you're just like, oh, well, this didn't live up to my expectations of this horrendous mother who really just should not have a child at all. And it really just brought this movie down quite a bit.
Yeah, even the final conflict between Carrie and her mother is just it's so
Anticlimactic.
yeah, she just stops her heart. There's no, major confrontation. There's no, again, I don't like to keep comparing, performances, but Piper Laurie is just like so amazing as Margaret. It just like really sticks with you. And I think that Patricia Clarkson is obviously like an actress of equal caliber. And I
Yeah.
really wish that, she could have brought some more of that energy because we've seen her do that in other roles, and so it just was really unfortunate that it ended the way it did, just with Carrie stopping her heart, and really there's no confrontation there. It doesn't really feel like much comes out or much is resolved in that action.
Yeah. Are there any particular moments that did stand out to you, though, as either having potential or just being some moments that you liked more than probably the majority of the movie?
I do think that when the bucket of blood falls on Carrie, and she goes into that almost trance like state and walks through the gymnasium that's on fire, and her walk through past the gas station and then through the town. I thought that was pretty well done. That was probably the highlight of the movie for me. Uh, I think that the energy of the movie really changes like once they get to the prom. Like I think the direction is a little better and
Yeah.
the writing is a little better from that point on. And so it's interesting because it feels like that's the part that the filmmakers really wanted to go with, and the rest of it is just kind of like filler. So I did enjoy the kind of prom scene and aftermath.
They did do a very good job of replicating the iconic Carrie look because as soon as the blood falls on her, that's the look everyone really knows. She's drenched and her pink dress is now covered in red, and it's just like her hair is looking completely disgusting because it's full of this nasty blood. And when she's in that trance like state, you understand, okay, this is what this movie has been building to. And all of the high school drama stuff was very of the time. It was even more so than the original movie. And I felt like I was watching some teen drama in movie form, and it just kind of went a little too long in that area too, because you see Sue Snell trying to be nice to Carrie, getting Tommy to ask her to the dance and everything, but she's also still one of the popular girls, and she kind of just goes back to normal every time she's not planning to, have Tommy ask Carrie to the dance. So it felt a little disjointed for her character in particular because she is part of the group of girls who gang up on her when she gets her period in the shower and starts freaking out. They all start chanting at her, including Sue, and it kind of just goes back and forth too much with her to really get a sense of how much she actually cares. And then the police interview was super weird, and her character felt disjointed a little. But with Carrie, her character was played exactly as expected from start until they change things up and she lives.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that Angela Bettis gives a really consistent performance, and I
Yeah.
think every moment that she has is really believable as Carrie, which I feel like the other characters don't really have, like either in terms of their behavior or like their dialogue. It just like exits the realm of believability. But I think that Angela Bettis really stayed believable as Carrie throughout the whole thing.
I would say the same for Tommy too, because you get that early scene where Carrie's in the library glancing up at him while he's reading a book, and these other guys start making fun of her because it's clear that she likes him. And, of course, he's the popular, cute guy in high school, and a lot of girls probably like him, but he takes the book and chucks it at this guy's head because he's being a total dick to Carrie. And it's that moment where you're like, okay, Tommy is not like the other guys. He's not your stereotypical jock, popular guy. And that remains consistent throughout as well. So I think getting those two characters right really helped things improve during the prom scene.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. And I think that you do actually like Tommy in this. And I think, which again makes it all the more weird that Sue is so ambivalent about his death in the police station interviews, because Tommy legitimately seems like a good guy.
You would think she would be at least upset about him dying for sure. Maybe not everyone else, because she kind of knew that these people weren't great. And you have the gym teacher who's explaining to Carrie, you know, this is the peak for these girls. And while that might not necessarily remain true today, I do feel like there was a point in time where the popular kids maybe didn't go on to be quite as successful as everyone thought they would be.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that her speech to Carrie is another one of the good parts of the prom. It's a little bit dated, but even, you know, for the time, I think that it works pretty well, and it gets the point across, and it gives, you know, Carrie something to hope for, which I feel like again is like undercut by the fact that she lives, because I think that the fact that Carrie dies and then she's just gotten this speech beforehand from the gym teacher, I think is one of the aspects that makes her story so heartbreaking.
I also really did enjoy the scene where the principal stands up to Chris Harkinson's father, who is this hotshot lawyer, and he just whips out Chris's file and is like, well, your daughter is a piece of trash, basically.
Yeah, that was a good scene too.
It was one of those things where you were like, okay, there are people standing up for Carrie. This means, you know, hopefully Chris will lay off her, and obviously we know the prom scene's going to happen. You cannot have a Carrie movie without it, but it gives you a little hope that there's at least a couple people in Carrie's corner. But I still didn't like the ending, because I was like, I understand, but Carrie needs to die. Like, I'm sorry, that's just how it has to be.
Yeah, for sure. And like, even if they had gone with, you know, they didn't have to do the De Palma ending with like the house caving in on her and her mom. You know, in the book, she has like a brain aneurysm from overusing her power.
Yeah.
I would have even been fine with that than her just like living and traveling to Florida.
Yeah, and I love the element of the town just becoming a place that nobody lives in, a place that nobody wants to go to, nobody wants to rebuild there, or, you know, anything like that. That was one of the endings that I felt was a little more powerful for Stephen King, because when I've been going through the books, I've been talking a lot about endings, and sometimes he tacks on like one thing too many to the endings. He'll like toss in an epilogue, and I'm like, you didn't really need that. But with Carrie, because of the way the book is, and you're seeing all of these news clippings and things like that, you understand why that book ends the way it does. So to have this movie go in the complete opposite direction, not really make it clear what happened to the town either, it was just a disappointing ending that kind of killed any momentum that the prom scene had going for it.
Definitely. And I just like the idea of, you know, continuing Carrie's story with her like helping other, you know, telekinetic kids is just like it's such a weird idea. It's such a early 2000s, you know, idea where they're trying to copy off of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Smallville. It very much seems like they wanted it to go in that direction, but it's just like, it's so not Carrie, and it's just not what I think Stephen King really had in mind. So it just really, it takes the air out of the story.
I will say, though, I would love to see Brian Fuller take another stab at a Stephen King adaptation, because I think now that he's done Hannibal, he might have more leeway and be able to get a bigger budget and maybe do something that's not on TV, or even something like a TV miniseries on HBO or something. I just kind of want Brian Fuller to get another shot, because this ended up being a disappointment. And the original network it was released on was NBC. So you can't really, like I said earlier, do too much with that. It's like they have their limitations for what they will show on TV. And you could tell right off the bat with the shower scene. It was not like the shower scene in the original by a long shot. So I feel like it just ultimately ended up falling flat. Is there anything we haven't touched on, though, that you want to touch on, Richard?
Oh, I would love to touch on how the meteor scene in the beginning was handled. Just because like that is kind of from the book, but I feel like that's one of the things where like in terms of doing a straight adaptation like doesn't entirely work, at least not on like a television budget.
Yeah, I actually had a note about that too because I had recently watched Rose Red, which it's not the same thing that happens, but the girl basically has rocks fall from the sky into someone's house because their dog attacked her or something. And I was like, this feels a lot like they were trying to kind of replicate something that, yes, happens in the book, but also visually happens in Rose Red.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was just I think a weird handling of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that definitely could have been left out. So it's interesting to me of like the things from the book that they decided that they wanted to put in there and then the things from the book that they just discarded.
Certainly some odd choices were made there, but I think ultimately I ended up giving this a 2 out of 5. I felt like I really couldn't rate it any higher just because I really was not super thrilled about the ending. I was like, oh no, I don't think I can, go any higher than a 2 for this, even though they did get good performances out of at least some of the cast members.
Yeah, I also gave it a 2 out of 5 in my rating too. I think like the majority of that is definitely Angela Bettis's performance.
It really is, and I will definitely be checking out that other horror movie that you said she was in because I think she plays this sort of socially awkward, lonely character pretty well.
Yeah, she does. Yeah, that movie May, it's definitely worth checking out. I think she gives a brilliant performance in it, and it's one of my favorite horror movies from the early 2000s.
Awesome. Well, Richard, is there anything you want to plug real quick before we go here?
You can find my work. I usually post it on Twitter. So I'm at Richard L. Newby on Twitter, and always happy to talk about genre stuff, horror, Stephen King. So yeah, just reach out. Always happy to talk.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on to talk about the 2002 TV movie Carrie today.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
All right, that does it for this episode of Chat Sematary. You can support the podcast on Patreon for $1 a month. You'll get a thank you on the show. For $2 a month, I will send you a Chat Sematary sticker. And if you want to follow us on social media, you can do so at Chat Sematary on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You could also rate and review the show. That's a huge help. And as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.